we miss out when we don't sit and reflect on the sacredness of those moments and the sacredness of, yeah, just her body and her holding you and her even, folding an envelope and standing in front of a fax machine. I mean, I believe, and sort of what I'm arguing in Abuelita Faith is that's where God is, that's where God is moving and working, and in those sacred, seemingly ordinary, but not at all ordinary, God is intimately acquainted with our grandmothers in those moments and just in life in general.
Hey friends, welcome back to the podcast with me, Jonathan Puddle. This is episode 122. My guest this week is a brand new friend. Her name is Kat Armas. She is the author of Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength. If you listened to last week's interview with Michael F. Bird, he said one of the really important things we need to do is to read deeply in our own tradition and then to read outside of our own tradition. And so this week and the next episode of the podcast will be focusing on bringing in stories outside of our own and helping us lean into the wisdom and truth that can be held in different kinds of ways, especially if we're wanting to move away from an empirical kind of truth lens, as we discussed with Brian Zand and then again with Mike Bird. So I'm thrilled that I get to bring Kat Armas to you today. If you don't know her, she is wonderful. Kat is a Cuban-American writer and speaker. She hosts the Protagonistas podcast. She holds a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Arts in Teaching. She knows her stuff. She has written for a great many different magazines and outlets, and I really think you're going to enjoy what she has to share with us today. She is also a brand new mom. She was pregnant when we recorded this and recently had a baby. So have a listen to this and then make sure you go and follow her, Kat_Armas on Instagram, and there'll be much more details, of course, in the show notes along with the transcription for this episode. Here we go. Kat Armas, I'm so glad to welcome you to the show. I've been just following you for a little while on Instagram and just been reading through this beautiful book, Abuelita Faith, and I'm really enjoying it. And I'm glad to get to know you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here and to be able to chat with you about it.
I have not read a spiritual reflection about grandmothers before.
Really? It's your first one. I mean, I don't think many people have. Yeah, but I'm so happy that you are. And I'm hoping, that it's having you reflect on your grandmothers, whether biological or not.
It is. It certainly is. Both of my grandmothers were women of faith. There's a lot of Christian faith, like I think in some directions, 5 or 6 generations in my family. So I come from a long line of various different Protestants. And they were really formative for me, but I haven't often been given reason to think about that,
right?
Or to think about just, I guess, like the theological impact of their, not just their teaching, which is like the obvious, but I guess like their lived embodiment of what they believed. I'd love to hear just at the high level a little bit about what this is to you, what Abuelita Faith is, and what brought you to birth this thing.
Yeah. Well, I think what you just described is part of it, right? I think so many of our grandmothers and our abuelitas have been overlooked because of how I mentioned in the book, whether it be, their gender or their socioeconomic status or whatever it is. My grandmother wasn't formally educated. And I think that is a big part of it, right? So many of our grandmothers were not formally educated. They didn't have that opportunity. And so in Western culture, we're sort of, taught or trained to look for the folks who have the quote unquote traditional form of knowledge, and that is, as far as theologically goes, that is formal theological education, and so that's where we've been trained to find or learn the most about God. And in my experiences, once I stepped into the world of formal theological education, I think that's where I felt the most distant from God, because so much of what I was learning or who I was learning from was so separate from my lived experience, and so, so different than how what was taught to me as the norm was not my norm growing up. And so it made me question very much, my my upbringing, my experiences, who I am, my cultural background and my ethnicity. It had me questioning, well, then what's my place here? What does God have to offer me, or what do I have to offer to my community? And so, yeah, so I think that that's sort of where this book idea, or just this, in general, just life existential crisis, that I began wrestling with, this sort of Abuelita faith is, once I was raised Catholic, and then once I transitioned to Protestantism, and like I said, and began formal seminary education, I began to question my grandmother's salvation. I really thought, oh my goodness, she's not saved. But yet I had decades of memories of her committed to the church and committed to, her community, and then so that's where I began reflecting, wait a minute, I learned the most about God growing up in informal spaces, not from, the white men behind the pulpits and in the classrooms, but around the dinner table with my grandmother, and watching her sew, and all of these embodied experiences. And that's where I learned the most about God. And so I wanted to invite folks to wrestle with that too. Who is unnamed that you have been formed by, and so anyway, I'm really glad that you have been wrestling with that.
Yeah, that's really
with my book.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned like ways of being in knowledge, forms of knowledge, right? I wasn't something that I guess I had a lot to really think about until I read last year, the year before, I read Saving the Gospel from the Cowboys by Richard Twiss. And part of his whole thesis is the format of this thesis is not functional outside of an empirical context, outside of this ivory academic white tower. The ways that we teach, the ways that we know. And so he's like, even playing the white man's knowledge game is this problem that we have. That was that I guess opened my mind to start hearing and seeing some of these things and realizing, oh yeah, there's all these different ways of knowing and of being.
Yeah, no, I think that that's key, actually. That's what I'm really trying to get at Abuelita Faith is that there are alternate ways of knowing and being in the world, and I think that that's, when we talk about decolonizing, I know that that's become a buzzword, and it's kind of thrown around, but in my writing of Abuelita Faith, I wanted to wrestle with the notion of decolonization, and obviously there's different ways you can do that. But the way that I wanted to wrestle with that is, what is knowledge, and who is wise, and who gets to say, right? Who gets to say what is wisdom or what is knowledge? And so I'm sort of wrestling with this, even biblical idea of wisdom, which, if you read, there's just so many different ways that you can understand or apply wisdom. And I think that, it was fun to wrestle with that in the Bible, and then also just wrestle with that in across history with our abuelitas and our grandmothers, and how they engage wisdom in their everyday life.
Yeah. So can I read from you? Yeah. You wrote this when you're unpacking the concept. Abuelita theology stems from the reality that in Latine religious culture, matriarchal figures such as abuelitas preserve and pass along religious traditions, beliefs, practices, and spirituality. They function as live-in ministers, particularly because the privilege to receive formal religious instruction is often unavailable. Thus, abuelitas are the functional priestesses and theologians in our familias. And please forgive my bumble.
No, you did great.
That was really interesting to me, because at the very outset, when I began to read the book, I thought, okay, you're presenting an argument. You're suggesting that we need to pay attention to this thing. Our grandmothers, and especially my sense is that you are offering something here for other members of Latin culture, but also indigenous groups and so on, right? Like, you could just be writing to white people or be a white person writing blah, 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 but you are offering something authentically from yourself to your own community.
Mm.
But not are you just, I realized in that sentence, I'm like, oh, she's not just trying to tell me that, like, advocating for this thing. This is what's already happening. This is
Right. Oh,
just
yeah.
normal life.
Yeah.
So let's stop ignoring it or throwing it under the rug, or devaluing the work that's already happening and been happening for all of human history.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And I'm so glad that you thought about that, or kind of got that. Because that is one of my arguments, is just, women, abuelitas, our grandmothers, they've been doing the thing, and whether it's been in the background or whatever, they've been doing the thing forever. And I think we're the ones, and by we, I just sort of mean dominant culture in general. Dominant culture is the one that's been missing out, because this has been happening. And those are sort of the stories that I'm trying to bring up, right? The stories of women who have, used their bodies and their art as protest, or have, I mean, countless women throughout history. And so I try and, bring in these stories and these anecdotes and say, see, look, and another thing that I sort of bring up is this idea of, inviting the, marginalized women or whatever to the table. And I'm saying, no, they have their own tables. Like my grandmother had her own table. It was her table. She set it every day, and we were invited to sit at her table. And she was the host and we were the guests. And I think that that's really important. Again, thinking about this idea of decolonization, I say that it's like a decolonized notion of hospitality. Christianity, we love to talk about hospitality, but it's very much so that we are always the hosts, or the dominant culture is always the host. And exactly like you said, no, I mean, people have their own tables, they've had them forever. Women have been doing the things, protesting, like I mentioned, being subversive, fighting for their communities, and for themselves, all of these things for centuries, since the beginning of time. And it's just a matter of us, turning our gaze and our focus and paying attention.
Yeah, that's so good. I love I can feel internally this process that I've come to identify as learning and being corrected in my thinking. And even
Yeah.
just as you say that, like the you, I'm laughing at my own self and my attempts to be a gentle, wise listener. And it's like, oh yeah, invite people to the table, and like, yeah, or just bear in mind that they have
Right.
tables and have been doing the thing. And I can feel my body reacting to that truth.
Well, I mean, that's great. And I think it's part of it is just, learning how to be a good guest. I think that's something that I've been wrestling with a lot. How can we be good
I don't think
guests?
okay, sorry for interrupting you.
Oh,
I
no.
don't think evangelical, especially American influenced Christians, have any concept of what it means to be a guest.
No, not at all. I mean, if you think about it, throughout history, what do Christians know about being guests? I mean, if you think about, the colonial period, and folks just arrived in places that weren't their own and just made themselves, I mean, they didn't learn from anyone or try to, or, we think about it now. And when we think of, again, the dominant culture, it doesn't know how to be a guest. And again, and it's perpetuated by Christianity. We want to be the heroes, and we want to be the evangelizers, and the ones to offer the good news. And we don't ever think of how we can receive, or what we can learn, or just sitting at someone else's feet and learning from their wisdom. We think that Christianity, or Christians in general, obviously I'm generalizing, but for so long we think that only we have something to offer the world, right? But yeah, no, I don't think that. I think being a good guest is something that we would do well, and by we, again, just the dominant culture would do well in learning and embracing.
Okay, yes, that's so real. Wow. Yeah, and right, when someone comes to your home and is a weird guest, or they come in and they assert themselves, or they start
Right.
on things, and I have a couple of friends that I'm thinking of specifically who do this. And I can tell as an empath that they are themselves uncomfortable and do not know how to conduct themselves. And the only way they have is to assert their dominance.
Right.
but yeah, it's like, oh, that's so weird. That's such a good point. Okay, so paint a picture for me, if you would, of some of the things that we miss out on when we're not paying attention to this format of faith and this way of being.
Yeah, I mean, so much, right? But I would say the main thing that I think about is, and I mentioned this in the book. I think that we talk about being made in the image of God in an individual way, right? Like I'm made in the image of God, you're made in the image of God. But something that I had been reflecting on as I was working on this book is how the image of God is also collective. We each of us, carry a piece of the image of God, or however you want to phrase. I don't think anybody fully understands what that means, but all of us together in our own, at the fullness of what it means to be human and all of our distinct cultures and all of our distinct, everything. I think together we get a fuller image of, who God is. And I think that, when we aren't seeing not just the image of God individually in a person, because it's easy to say that we see that, but what can we learn about God, just and who God is, from folks who are just trying to survive. And I think that that's something that I really try and lean into in Abuelita Faith, is this idea of survival, and how survival is in and of itself a holy endeavor. For most folks across the world, I mean, that is just the daily struggle, is what am I going to eat today? What am I going to feed my child today? There's no 5-year plan, or there's no, it's just literally, as I mentioned in Abuelita Faith, it's the Lord's Prayer, give me my daily bread, like what I need today, my strength, my food, my sustenance today, to make it till tomorrow, and then there's something sacred and intimate and holy about that, right? Just in and of itself. It doesn't have to be Christianized in the way that we, it's just, that's what it is. And when I read the Bible, as I was working on this book and researching scripture, I noticed that is most of the stories in scripture, right? Like folks just trying to live, and these stories are, again, hyper spiritualized, and they're, the story of Ruth and Naomi, and Boaz is Jesus or whatever. I mean, but it's just kind of like, well, it's also a story of two women that really are just trying to, ensure that they don't die, from being widows, and that, that they're taken care of. And they enact their agency and their creativity and their ingenuity, in order to just live. And they are called blessed. I mean, there's a whole book written about them. They are in the genealogy of Jesus. I mean, these are not just passing stories, same thing with the story of Esther, or just so many women. Their struggle to survive is a holy and sacred endeavor, and it is noticed and blessed, and whatever you want to say, by God, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that I think that that those of us with varying levels of privilege, we really, really miss out on. What can we learn about life and God, and how God interacts with people, and how God is intimately in the details of just survival. And we don't know much of that, because many of us, carry varying levels of privilege. And so it kind of cushions us from really experiencing that intimate, connection with the divine.
Yes. Yes, that's so true. Even you mentioned the Lord's Prayer, right? I was the other thing beyond daily bread that just popped into my mind as you said that was like, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others, right? Like so many of us in more privileged positions, who's trespassing against us, man? Like,
Right.
because I'm a Christian in a Western nation, and I feel like I'm being marginalized and all that.
Right.
I'm like when
Right.
so many people on the margins have a boot on their neck. Like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, there's that guy who rapes people. There's that guy who
Right.
murdered my son. Like
Right.
the closeness to evil being perpetrated against you
Right.
feels so much closer, that I think,
Yeah.
many folks like myself are familiar with.
Right. No, that's good. I think that that's true. And I think that that's something that, in the beginning of my book, I share about Rigoberta Menchú, and she's a Quiche Mayan indigenous activist. And I just love her story, because it sort of reminds me of what you were saying, that she ended up leading her community and her people in literally fighting against the colonizers or the oppressors in Guatemala and
Yeah.
her indigenous people. And it was through her reading the Bible and reading the story of David and Goliath and saying, wait a minute, we are literally David, and the colonizers, right? The government who is trying to exterminate the indigenous people to take their land, is Goliath. And so that was sort of like what motivated her to lead her people to take up arms against, the colonizers. And I think that, yeah, as you mentioned, there are so many things that we are shielded from, those of us who carry varying levels of privilege, and we don't understand the Bible in the same way. Even we don't understand the stories within it. That's why we like to say hyper spiritualize or over spiritualize so many of the stories, because we have to in order to connect with them. But as I mentioned, Abuelita Faith, so many of these stories are about our grandmothers. They're about, when our grandmothers read the story of the woman at the well, they say, oh yeah, that's me. That's my story. Or when they read the story of the Canaanite mother who is seeking, healing for her daughter, and she talks back to Jesus. I mean, those are the stories of our grandmothers and most grandmothers across the globe, that we have to sort of figure out what this story means. But for many folks, it just means it is what it is, and it's real life and it's lived experience.
That's so amazing. Yes, because of course, like, okay, is it Elijah or Elisha and the widow with the?
Oh yeah,
It's like this is our last bread and
right,
our last flour, and we're gonna die tomorrow.
mm-hmm.
And I've only ever been taught that story in the context of like becoming a man of great faith who raises people from the dead, like
right.
very charismatic upbringing here. If you're not raising 3 dead people every day, you're not a good Christian. And so, yeah, but like that's the context that I've been taught that story, and that's always the connection point, is like have great
Yeah.
faith. And
Oh
yet
yeah.
I'm hearing you say the majority of humans, especially women on this planet, would be like, no, that's a story about not dying.
Yeah.
Like that's a story about last Monday.
Right. Yeah. No, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think of that in the same, I mentioned the story of Tabitha and Peter raises Tabitha from the dead. And I just think it's so funny. I mean, it's not funny, but I just think it's so interesting that when you read any translation, literally any Bible translation, and you know how they have the chat or the paragraph or chapter sort of headlines.
But he chose to insert.
Right, exactly. Like, whoever, just decided to write, okay, this is what this chapter's about, And if you read it right before Tabitha's story, I mean, it always says like Peter resurrects someone or something, it's about Peter resurrecting someone, right? And when I read that story, I mean, that's the last thing that I'm paying attention to is Peter doing anything. I mean, I read that story, and you have this woman who clearly was, this person, this very important person in her community, because she was resurrected. I mean, how many people in the New Testament besides Jesus are resurrected? Like 3. So why is she resurrected? She's called a disciple. There are people by her bedside weeping. And all we know about this woman is that she made clothes for her community. And that is a sacred, what I argue is a sacred thing among many communities across the globe. Making art, embodied theology. I mean, these are all beautiful things. And yeah, I mean, the point of that story in many Christian circles is, oh, look, Peter resurrected someone just like Jesus, but no, if we even read a couple chapters in Acts right before that story, we know of the whole debacle between the Greek-speaking Jews and the widows. They were being overlooked, and all of this was happening. And here we have Tabitha, a couple cities down the road, doing the very thing that people were neglecting to do. But yet she's overlooked. It's all about Peter and what, so it's all about, let's be like Peter. I don't know, how about let's be like Tabitha? Yeah. So I thought about that as you were mentioning that story, because that's what we do so much with so many of these stories.
You mentioned the clothing, and you've got a fair bit about the creation of clothing.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that kind of community, tactile spirituality, because I feel like, again, that's something that, I'm like this picture of globalism. I've lived in 5 countries. I don't live in the same country that I was born in. None of my children live in the same country they were born in. And I can only talk to my mother through Zoom or Facebook or whatever. And all my grandmothers are dead. And I do feel this disconnection at an ancestral level at times from place and space and family.
Right.
And I feel there's a longing when I read you,
right.
you say some of these stories. You talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, and I think, it's, very common, right? Like your story is very common. I think we live in a globalized world, and, even I don't live in Miami where I was raised, and I've never lived in Cuba, which is something, that what I talk about in Abuelita Faith, it is this idea that, we're always connected to land and we're always connected to place. And while I've never lived in Cuba, I do believe that Cuba lives within me, right? It is a part of me. And I'm pregnant right now, and I believe that it's going to be it's a part of my child, because as we read in scripture, place is so important. I mean, the story of the Israelites is all about place and land, but to answer your question specifically about, the whole sewing and this embodied theology, I mean, that's something that for me, growing up, that was a huge part of my upbringing, is just watching my grandmother make clothes, and of course, as a child, I never thought of that as a theological or spiritual thing. But as I reflected on it, the older that I got, and the more that I was reflecting so much, and again, just scripture and embodied theology. And it was really the story of Tabitha that sparked that in me, and seeing, her story and thinking, wait a minute, all we know about this quote unquote disciple who is resurrected is that she made clothes for the widows in her community. And that tells me that that is a sacred and holy and beautiful act. And that there's something about that, that we need to pay attention to. And as I'm reading that, I thought, that's my grandmother's story. As I mentioned, like these are the stories of so many of our grandmothers. And the story of Tabitha is the story of my grandmother in many ways. And so reflecting on her life and how, she was so intentional with her clothes making, and how she created entire worlds with her hands, with a needle and a thread, and how, she created community within our, within her home, with the women in our neighborhood, or just, in our community, and she created this feeling in this space, in this sacred space. And I believe that is something, again, that is overlooked, how women have been using their bodies throughout history, in ways that not only honor God, but that reflect, the creativity of God, and reflect the intentionality of God. We see that I kind of point that back to even God creating clothes in the garden for Adam and Eve. That was such an intimate and intentional act. And these are ways that I think that many women throughout history have connected with God, and have connected with their communities. And we have so much to learn about a sort of embodied, lived way of being and knowing that is sacred.
We'll take a quick pause to say thank you to my patrons. Big love to Janet, who is my latest patron. Thanks for signing up. Friends, I love doing this podcast. It brings me so much life and joy. I'm so glad to be able to share it with you every week. It's also a huge investment of time and energy. So if you are listening to the show, would you please consider joining up? You can become a patron for $3 a month, but if you give $10 a month, I'll send you a handwritten card in the mail. How cool is that? Anyway, grateful that you're listening, grateful that you're here. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/Jonathan Puddle. Thanks so much to everybody who supports. You mean the world to me. Let's get back to the show.
I also reflect on women who have used their hands and their bodies. There's a group of women, they're called the arpilleristas in Chile, and they literally created with their hands, they sewed protest signs about, the government was taking, and people were disappearing. Their family members were disappearing. There was so much injustice. And these women, were using their skills and their passions and their gifts and their art, to protest against the injustices that were happening, in their communities. And so I think that that's not something to be overlooked. And I think that, if we believe that God gives us gifts and talents and passions, to do good in the world, and that's one of them. So yeah, so that's something that has been very beautiful for me to reflect on, both in history and in my community, but also in scripture, because that is something that is so much in the Bible.
Totally. That's so interesting. I love that. I'm thinking about my grandmother. There was my maternal grandmother I was a lot closer to, and we often lived with them. And it's just funny. And I'm trying to think, is this just cognitive bias because you're saying this to me? But so much of what I think about is all surrounding her body. And
Yeah.
highly physical. Partly, she was paralyzed in one leg, and so she wore a brace, and so she had a shuffling sound that would kind of follow her around. There's this tactility, and I remember all these. I remember her standing at the fax machine, getting the prayer list and sending prayer requests on to the next people. I remember her teaching me how to make little envelopes, and I was just telling my 8-year-old this. We would cut out calendars and take the photo, and then I would fold and cut them into an envelope, and I would sell envelopes to all the neighborhood people. And my grandmother used to make, I don't know if you know those cards where it's like you stamp the card and then you sprinkle the kind of stuff on it and then you kind of melt it.
I think so.
Some kind of crafty art thing. But this, again, this is something that my grandmother used to always, I can picture my grandmother ironing. She used to come to our house and iron all of our laundry. And it's like, and it's so funny because at the time, none of that was meaningful to me as like a
right.
child, especially as like a young boy. None of that seemed meaningful to me. But as I think back on it now, I mean, more than anything, my core formative memory of my grandmother is of her holding me at 15 or 16 when they were selling the family vacation home, and it was the last time I was going to see it.
Yeah.
And I was so emotional and didn't know as a teenage boy how to unlock all that. And she just came and held me.
Wow.
I just remember sobbing on her shoulder.
That's so beautiful.
And feeling kind of embarrassed because I had my buddies over there, but I'm like, there's something that now I can see the sacred spirituality of all of her simple life.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
My mother says, I remember my mother said to me that her mom lived vicariously through her children and her grandchildren. That she didn't have any career after her first child was born. And her focus was on children and family and community. And how little value we have for that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing all of that about your grandmother. And I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, we miss out when we don't sit and reflect on the sacredness of those moments and the sacredness of, just her body and her holding you and her being there and all those, again, those intentional and intimate details of even, folding an envelope and standing in front of a fax machine. I mean, I believe, and sort of what I'm arguing in Abuelita Faith is that's where God is, that's where God is moving and working and and doing all the things, in those sacred, seemingly ordinary, but not at all ordinary, they are ordinary, but not at all not sacred, right? Moments. And I think that that's something that, what a beautiful thing for our spiritual life, when we can reflect on that and recognize that, man, that's where God is intimately acquainted, with our grandmothers in those moments and just in life in general. And I think that that's something that has been so beautiful for me, as I reflect on this Abuelita faith and how I just try and live out an Abuelita faith in my everyday life. It's funny because I am, formally educated, I have 2 masters and I'm getting more degrees next year. I'm continuing my theological education next year, but still, even in that, I'm still trying to every day fight against that's not the most important, those moments where I was mostly educated or formed theologically were in those, in front of the fax machine moments, or, in my grandmother's arms as I wept moments. That's where I see God. And so I think it's incredible to be able to shift, sort of our focus and see life in that way.
Yes, I love that. Okay, I have a question, and this is a bit more of a tender question. And even in asking it, I don't even like it, but I'll explain.
Okay.
Um, how do we interface this with grandmother trauma or mother trauma, where these figures in our life have also been, in some cases, the authors of great pain and great toxicity in our lives? And one of the reasons I don't like the question is like, just because, so let me just like, it's not as if all the other teachers that we've had have not also traumatized.
Right.
It's like, please don't hear anybody
No.
listening to me suggesting that grandmothers or mothers have the market cornered on trauma, because we can talk all day, as we have on the show before, about abusive men. But if we are leaning into this, I know for some folks that may be a stumbling block.
No, that's a great question. And that's something that, I think about a lot and I wrestle with a lot. And so, even in my own culture, machismo is a huge part of my culture. And so something that I mention in Abuelita Faith is this idea that, an abuelita theology is often called a kitchen theology, right? Because it's formed in the kitchen. And, and that's a beautiful thing, right? When family members are sitting around the table and it's like this beautiful, informal, communal, familial thing. But at the same time, it's a kitchen theology because that's often where our grandmothers are relegated to, the kitchen. And so that is their space, in many ways, because they're forced to be there, or they have no other option than to be there. And so things like patriarchy and machismo, which our grandmothers perpetuate, right? Like, not saying that that's not something, my grandmother very much held to traditional and cultural norms. And even still to this day, there are many things like body shaming and just different things that our grandmothers, because of whether it was the generation that they come from or whatever, the culture and all these things. So that's 100% a part of the tension, right? When thinking about this abuelita theology. I don't know if you've read Dr. Yolanda Pierce's In My Grandmother's House, but it's sort of a sister book to mine in a way. And she is speaking from the perspective of Black women. And this is something that she talks a lot about. And the reason why I brought it up is because her and I had a conversation about both of our books, and sort of, kind of dialoguing with this idea and this tension of survival, and how survival is complicated. And survival, while it can be holy and beautiful and sacred, and I believe that it is, like, I believe that just the struggle to survive is holy and sacred. But at the same time, survival forces folks to do and just be and exist in ways that, that they may not necessarily want to, or things that may not necessarily be helpful. I think of the story of Tamar and how, she was forced to, put her body in situations that I don't know if she, maybe wanted to or was proud of. I don't know, but that's because, for many women across history, survival forces folks to do things that make many other people uncomfortable. And so when I think of this tension, and I think about it again in my own life, as I reflect on my story, and obviously, my book wasn't focused on that aspect of the story, but there are times where I had to wrestle with that, and just wrestling with the reality that survival is complicated, and we can't ignore or just brush over that reality and say, oh well, it's fine, she was, no. But I think it's important to sit in that tension, sit in the tension of, it can be beautiful, but it can be really hard and really, not beautiful in many ways. But part of, what I try and lean into in Abuelita Faith is that tension, is, Christianity likes to gloss over things or make things, forgetting the word, sorry, pregnancy brain, but platitudes, we like to jump to platitudes, or but life is lived in that very complicated tension of beauty and pain and hardship and, all the things. And so I think that it's important to name it. And so I'm glad that you did, because I think that that's part of it, is naming it and sitting in that complexity.
That's good. Yeah, that's really helpful. Friends, I highly recommend this book to you, Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength by Kat Armas. And is that, it means like, it's like abuela is like the formal
right
grandmother.
Yes, abuela is the word for grandmother in Spanish. And then in Spanish, we add ita or ito, to the end of words. And that's, sort of like a term of endearment. And so,
Right.
It's like, it literally means my little grandmother, but it's just, it just sort of means like my beloved grandmother, or something along those lines.
Right. So I'm going to say like Nana, like this is like between like grandmother and like Nana or Granny.
Right.
And obviously whatever translates for each of you. Yeah, really, really enjoying this. Kat, where can folks find more on you? And I know you've got a podcast yourself.
Yeah. So my podcast is called The Protagonistas, or The Protagonistas. And I speak to women of color in church leadership and theology. And you can find me on Instagram or on Twitter, primarily at Kat_Armas, or my website, katarmas.com. I try and, update with things I've written or worked on. And so if you want to check that out as well.
Kat, would you pray for us as we, I guess, seek to listen and to be reoriented in this really kind of sacred, family, beautiful way?
Yeah, definitely. God, we are so thankful for just opportunities to talk with one another, and opportunities to learn and to be challenged and to grow, and to investigate what it means to be people of God, or people that are seeking to bring forth your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, as you mentioned. And so we just ask that you would allow us to give us eyes to see folks who have been doing the thing for so long, who have their own tables, who are struggling to survive, who are living, their lived experiences are holy and sacred moments and endeavors. And there's so much to learn, or we have so much to learn from folks in the margins, our abuelitas, our grandmothers. And would you give us eyes to see, God? And we're so thankful for the opportunity to be able to chat about these things. And we ask for your wisdom in alternate ways of being and knowing. May we learn from our grandmothers in that way. And it's in Jesus' wonderful name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kat. Friends, go hit the show notes at jonathanpuddle.com. You'll find the transcription for this episode. You will find links to order Kat's book, Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength. And it's a great, great book. I really recommend it. I've been learning and growing, and she is so well... It's just such an international perspective on our nanas and grannies and abuelitas, and it's really cool. It's definitely invited me into something, a new angle on my faith and on multi-generational faith. I think this is something that the church is wrestling with. I know folks in my church who are elderly and are feeling like they don't know how to serve. They don't know what their role is anymore. And so I really think this is important. So head over to jonathanpuddle.com, click podcast, you'll find the show notes, order Kat's book, and go follow her on Instagram, Twitter, and everywhere else. All right, friends, I'm going to take a break for a couple of weeks. I've got episodes in the can, excited to share stuff with you, but I am traveling. I am leaving this week to go to the UK for a few weeks. I'm visiting a friend, and I'm getting started on a new writing project. So we'll take a little pause on the podcast, but don't worry, we'll be back very soon, and I'm thrilled. My next guest shares his journey of being diagnosed autistic and how that changed his life and how we can do better for our autistic brothers and sisters. So that'll be on the show in a few weeks. All right, my friends, God bless, grace and peace to you all. We'll talk soon.